Good afternoon, everyone. This is Ibrahim Sundiata, again in beautiful Salvador da Bahia, Brazil, northeastern Brazil. And I have been speaking to my friends and my colleagues, and my colleagues who are my friends, for a couple of weeks about things of general interest to me and general interest, I hope, to the diasporic community. Now, I shall be coming home in several weeks. I've been in Brazil for about half a year and I'm returning. And then I shall be in Massachusetts for the US summer. And then as that summer goes away and becomes autumn, I'll be back in Brazil. But there's some things which are common and which both societies partake of. We talked about the black diaspora, which I'm very interested in. I'm in a place which now is getting floods of African American tourists, African American investors. There's a saying among some religious people, these are black Brazilian people, that Bahia is a Roma Negra, the black Rome. Now that means in a religious sense, in terms of West African religion. But I meet people now who want to establish McDonald's franchises, hair salons, nail salons, automobile dealerships, automotive repair shops, all kinds of African Americans who come here to make a better life. I guess a life they thought they couldn't make in the United States, in a place which is diasporic, which is part of this black scattering of people throughout the world. And Brazil, being the place that received most of the diaspora, is a place that's a focal point. I also mentioned in a previous video that Brazil is a center for sex tourism. Brazil is behind Thailand, is ahead of some other places, but it is a center. Now, what's interesting to me about that is that oftentimes things get all mixed up and confused, and you have people who come for diasporic tourism or heritage tourism, who stay for sex tourism, who mix it all together. And as somebody told me, someone heard me talking about it and said, so what? That's what the market will bear. If that's what they want to spend their money on, who are you to say no? And I'm not saying no. As I've said before, and this will be the third time. So listen up. There is no prostitution in Brazil. It's called the program. A woman or a man has the right to their body. And given as messed up and as goofed up as the U.S. judicial system is, and the number of all kinds of crimes committed throughout the United States, including the until recently victimless crime of marijuana smoking, I have no problem with Brazil in that. My problem is exploitation. People who come and who belong to persecuted minorities back home think they can come down here and all of a sudden become Miss Ann or Mr. Charlie and think they can exploit Brazilians. No. There are more of them than there are of you. And at some point, they may ask for you to go home. So be careful. Respect the culture that you are in. I keep saying that. Because there are more of them than there are of you, and you talk about, your green passport. Listen, this is a big economy. Brazil makes tanks and railway cars and a lot of stuff that you cannot imagine. Brazil has people who could buy and sell every man in the NBA. So when you say you can come down here and buy everyone, every man, woman, and child, you cannot. So let's be careful. Let's be respectful. Now the other thing is, what hits me a lot about Brazil and the difference with the US is that in the United States, we have a system of caste. And several years ago, Isabel Wilkerson, a journalist, who had written a prize-winning book called The Warmth of Other Suns, which was about the immigration in the 20th century of African Americans from the Deep South to the North and to the West. And what beautiful book, full of interviews and feeling and explaining why we have black populations in Minnesota and Michigan and Washington State and Northern California. Why? When we didn't have these populations in 1900, not in those areas, or those same numbers. Well, Isabel wrote another book called Caste, which I really liked. It was on the Oprah Winfrey Book Club. It was given some play, but not that much. A lot of people got nervous. A lot of my friends don't like the idea of caste. And we'll talk about what that is. Wilkerson said there are three great examples of caste in the world. One was Nazi Germany, where the Germans said that Jews were a race. They were going to be endogamous, that is, they were going to be in-marrying by force. They were going to be residentially segregated, and that in their blood they carried something which made them criminal, which made them untrustworthy, and made them inferior. The other example of caste, and is much older, it's around 5,000 years old, and it comes from India. And in India, there are various castes. There are four main castes, and then there are people below the caste system called untouchables, Dalits. And the Dalits are people without caste who are ritually unclean. They can not marry other people. They cannot go to certain religious institutions. It's prohibited. Not every religious institution is begging people to come in. There are Hindu temples that say, stay out. There are people considered darker and uglier and less employable. Now, the thing about caste in India is that India has had affirmative action laws since around 1950. And India has taken steps to attack this system, which is thousands of years old, in which people have been told, you're ugly, you're inferior, and people have believed it. There have been no major caste rebellions in a kind of romanticized Hollywood way in the history of Hinduism. The biggest revolt against caste in India came through Buddhism. That as Buddhism grew in maybe the 3rd century before the Christ, 2nd century, many people who were Hindus and had no caste became Buddhists. Buddhists, in theory, don't have caste. And they also get rid of reincarnation, because in caste, if you did something bad in one life, you can be born in a lower caste, in a dirtier caste, and if you've really been evil and wicked, your karma will get you back to being born as an outcast, an untouchable, an unclean thing. And if you believe that, because thousands and millions of people have believed it, you obey those rules. Now, in the United States, caste has been used around since the 1830s. The word pops up, and you found that Southern writers were talking about caste, that there was caste in the United States. And some vague comparisons to India, that the US had caste, that whites and blacks were indelible caste, that whites were whites forever, with a kind of purity that could never, ever be reached or broached. And blacks had a kind of impurity, a kind of ritual impurity that was so impure, so vile, it could never be washed away. So that one drop of black blood made the individual black and their descendants for the next 100,000 years, in theory. It never went away. Now, there were points like between 1880 and 1930 where the federal government counted mixed people. In 1930, groups like the Anglo-Saxon Leagues, which was a kind of high-class intellectual Ku Klux Klan, came up with the idea to the federal government that black blood was so inferior and so dirty that it would corrupt the nation unless the federal government said no. It was corrupt. Laws were made in which, what the U.S. created a word which I find interesting because it's repeated in other, I even find it Brazilians trying to say it. It's funny when Brazilians try to say this American word, which they mispronounce. Miscegenation, which is a word created in 1864 in the United States. This kind of bad generation. And so in the United States, actually well before 1930, but certainly in 1930, officially in the law, miscegenation was illegal in most states. Not in all states, but in most. And in many states, any marriage performed between a black and a white was illegal. The children were bastards. In many states, there was 20 years in prison. The man and the woman would go to prison for 20 years. In other states, this was not an option. In many, many states, from the statistics we have, the people were killed, murdered, the men castrated, lynched in the United States. The law changed around 1970. The law crept along until 1967, when the Supreme Court said that marriage and intimacy was so important, that the state could not intervene. Now this was 1967. It wasn't mentioned much. You could read about, foreigners could read about the American Civil Rights Movement and never hear about this. This was all kind of sub rosa. Okay, we had a law, we had laws, it's a footnote. It's a very important footnote. In 2023, the year in which I'm speaking to you, the Congress of the United States this year said that legislatures cannot pass laws prohibiting two things which are formally disgusting: miscegenation and sodomy. In many states, miscegenation, the intermarriage of people of different races, whatever that is, and cohabitation and sex between persons of the same sexes were sex crimes. And it's continued to almost past 2000 AD. And so this year, we found the federal government of the United States saying, oh my goodness, oh that's wrong. Well, if that's wrong, and what's interesting is, of course, most people in the Western Hemisphere are the products of this strange, in the case of racial intermingling, are these strange beings, these unicorns, hermaphrodites, whatever, because the vast majority of people in the Americas are mixed. This is not true in the United States, and probably will not be, because caste is internally enforced and externally enforced. In a caste regime, people believe my caste is important. I'm keeping it real. This is who I am. This is integral to me. This is what I really am. And the people outside said that is what you really are. You're endogamous by law and by force. You look different. You probably are poor. Your blood contains some kind of taint, something wrong with it. In the United States, by the 1830s, you found racists saying that what was wrong with African American blood, it was subhuman. It was monkey blood. Now that is a bit shocking. It's seeped into the law. And so we have it seeping to the law in 1930 and remaining until 1967. And today, very few people would say that. They would just say, well, that's the way it is. Or some of my friends say, well, you know, black genes are powerful. Or that's the way it's always going to be. Or can't we talk about something else besides sex? Most of us think about it a lot. Now, in Brazil, which is one of the most unequal countries on the face of the planet, there are not firm caste identities. There are all kinds of discriminations, all kinds of hierarchies based on pigment. But at the same time, the idea of equating racial intermarriage with sodomy, with homosexuality, is freakish. The United States is the country which is freakazoid in that respect. And this would also apply to the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and most countries in Latin America. The question is, what is the way in the future? What will happen? And probably, according to Wilkerson and others, and you know, her book, like I say, it was recommended by the Oprah Book Club. I had a lot of friends who bought it and didn't read it because it made them nervous. So I read it. I wrote a review of it, and now I'm invited to India to talk about it. Well, we'll see, because I don't see myself as an expert. But I would think that what Isabel Wilkerson says is a cautionary note. She says, you know, as time goes on, caste in the U.S. may begin to wobble. It may wobble. That there may be more and more and more intermarriage, something that Americans don't like to talk about, but it's actually increasing. It actually increases with education. A friend of mine, and he could have been lying, a friend of mine in Cambridge said, well, you know, most black men with PhDs are exogamous. And I said, well, I don't know that. I haven't read that. Let me read up on that. But how does it shake out economically? Who marries whom? And what does it say about the class structure in the U.S.? Wilkerson said something interesting. She said, we might have a situation like India, in which now there's what's called the creamy layer. And I love it. It's an Indian expression. It's used in the laws, the creamy layer. And the creamy layer in India are those people who've taken advantage of affirmative action, who moved up in AI and IT, moved up in politics. 2 presidents of India have been untouchables. My God. And so I said to my friend, well, we've had one president who's been sort of outcast. We may have another one. And my friend said, yes, well, you have to realize, did this change the position of most people in the lower or outcast in India? Did this really affect the economic structure? Or did it mean that slowly some people from the most excluded group were able to move out of that group and able to move into middle-class educated positions? And will this happen in the U.S.? Will people, a segment of African Americans, be able to move out and up? And will this sort of ironclad cage of race and caste begin to break down? But, as Wilkerson pointed out, and she's a righteous sister, she pointed out, there will be some people who are poorer and darker who will be left at the bottom of the pile. And that caste will have a perdurable impact in the United States for at least the next 4 or 5 generations. Being in Brazil, I've been thinking about this. Returning to the US, I'll be thinking about this. And I'll be talking to some of you about this, whether you want to or not. Now listen, I have talked enough. I'm going to stop. And my very wonderful editor, Pedro Henrique, will hopefully have some questions for me, which I didn't ask myself. And we will proceed with his questions, and hopefully in the future, when this opens up in a slightly different way, questions from you. One of the things I said to Pedro Henrique is, I think it's weird that everyone seems to agree with me. And he sort of said, I don't think so. You're just not giving them a chance. So anyway, we will go to some questions.
So, I would like to ask you, what is the view about the U.S. caste system, the general view the Americans have of it today? Because I think, for me at least, it was not a known fact that the U.S. had a caste system. I'd like to understand how the Americans in general feel about this still being a thing today.
Yeah, that's a question. Thank you. I think basically it doesn't matter. I think most Americans prefer not to think of it as a caste system. It's embarrassing to think of it as a caste system. Let's keep it real. Let's stay within our line. I've been watching a lot of humor since I've been down here in Brazil, watching a lot of humor on Netflix. And so I'm sitting there watching Netflix, and I see all this humor, and it's all racially based. It's about black people and white people, and black people and white people, and the whole assumption is that there's something integrally different about them. Although I learned in school a long time ago, it was a foreigner wrote the book, and saying, you take a group of white Southerners and white blacks, and you drop them in a completely alien environment, and y'all gonna be so similar, except that you won't like each other. I think that most Americans prefer not to think of caste. They think of race, but they think of race as perdurable. It's something that's around, it's not going to go away, it's been with us forever, you can't get rid of it, and that it is, let me tell you this. They will, instead of saying caste, say race. And race in the United States is the worst thing ever to happen to any people anywhere. And I read this in books, I read this in publications in the New York Times, that it's the worst thing ever to happen. I almost had an infarction 2 years ago. I was reading something, and I was reading some comparative book, some old book by some historian, and it was about emancipation. In 1861, beginning in the United States, in 1861 in Russia. And it said that there were over 20 million serfs in Russia in 1861. I said, that man is lying. There couldn't have been that many white people belonging to other white people. That's impossible. And besides, the fact that they were shorter, had shorter lifespans, that's a lie. The U.S. is the champion in true evil. Well, guess what? In terms of treatment, I've learned a lot of things. I even learned from James Baldwin, who had said a thing. He said, you think sometimes your heart will break, and then you travel, and then you see things that make your heart break. Thank you so much. One of the things that happened in the reviews of the book, Caste by Wilkerson, is some people said, well, the Nazi analog, the Nazi example wasn't the best. And they said, well, it was very brief, that the Nazi regime was around for 13 years, and that it put laws into effect which said that Jews were a race, Jews had to go to separate schools, Jews couldn't use water fountains, Jews couldn't use swimming pools, Jews couldn't use libraries, Jews could not intermarry with normal Aryan people. Now, one of the questions why many people said, well, that's not a good example, is brief, and also that Jews in Central Europe had been marginally casted before. And so until around 1870, in what's called Jewish emancipation, Jews lacked many rights that other people had, but were not fully casted. In other words, Jews couldn't go to certain schools, Jewish intermarriage was frowned upon. There were all kinds of inequalities built into the system, but at the same time, the system was not airtight for Jews. And the Nazis came in with an airtight system, which they wanted to be very much like India or the United States. In fact, and I think I'm so glad that Pedro asked me this question. In the mid-1930s, in 1935, Germany sent a commission, a racial commission to the United States to study the crown jewel of world racism, the United States. Sent a commission of anthropologists, sociologists, and historians, and they studied law books. They went to Mississippi. They studied miscegenation laws. They met Lothrop Stoddard, who was a New England savant, a sort of great proponent on the radio of racism. They met all kinds of important people at universities, major universities. But one of the things that this commission did not do when they went home is they did not impose hyperdescent. They just thought that was a bit crazy. Hyperdescent is the one-drop rule. So Nazi Germany, even though they knew about the one-drop rule and they studied the good old US of A, they left the US of A with that prize. US of A is the champion of the one-drop rule, which it loves and which it created. And it loves it as much as apple pie and the American flag. The other two examples, India, which is an old example, which doesn't seem to be able to go away, it doesn't seem to be going away, although there are laws. But there's a lot of racial violence in India. There's a lot of violence around caste. In the United States, caste seems very unstable. And so it's possible for people to live where they want to, not always, there's opposition, to marry whom they want to, not always, there's opposition, but more and more and more. And so that's one of the differences. The US is sort of the middle example. Thank you for the question. Dear friends and colleagues, please share this video with your friends and your colleagues. Share it on YouTube and Spotify and Instagram, any way you want to. One of the things that's happened is that several friends have said, oh, we love it. And then I got one message from one man who said, you crazy. And you know, I mean, not to be strange, but I value that one remark, you crazy, almost as much as I do as all the sweet, kind wishes of all my dear friends. Because I can think about what this man meant when he said you crazy. So I look forward to your kind comments, your good comments, and your constructive criticism. And I hope that we can determine together that neither you nor I are crazy. Thank you.